I think one thing that we've definitely seen in the last 2 years, both individually but also within government, is the power that technology can have. I think the way that information was spread during the pandemic, the fact that we were able to mobilize a large amount of funds and resources down into people's accounts, the way that awareness could be spread at such a big scale, to some degree it could not have been possible without technology. And I think today, one thing is clear, that we are part of a new welfare architecture, which does rest within the digital age. At CPR, I lead an initiative called the Accountability Initiative, and we've been working to ensure more responsive governance. And by that, what I mean to say is that a system where policies and programs are both designed and implemented, keeping in mind citizen needs. I remember when we first started, one of the first things that we were trying to do is actually try and understand how much money reaches that Anganwadi center or school. And it was fascinating because even the state often didn't have that answer. So we would go down to the Anganwadi center, go down to the school and actually literally look at passbooks, look at cash books, have conversations with head teachers, with households, with Anganwadi workers, with primary healthcare, doctors, nurses, A&Ms, just to understand, कि आपको पैसा मिला, did you get your money, what did you spend it on, when did you get it? And that was, of course, 2009, 2010. Today, of course, a lot more information exists. There's no doubt that the digital revolution has a significant impact it can play on fiscal policy as well. Government has access to lots more data, and in theory, at least the ability to collect, process, analyze, and disseminate widely large amounts of data in a timely manner, in a transparent manner. We have computer apps, dashboards. All of us are, of course, used to Zoom now and Meet and WebEx and all of these aspects. And even within government, you've seen this transition, which started, of course, prior to the pandemic, but almost went even faster during the pandemic. But there are also questions in terms of what this transition means for citizens. Very real questions in terms of whether are we compromising accountability in the name of efficiency? How have the nature of interaction between citizens and state changed? And to use Landpritch's provocative title, is the use of technology a band-aid to kind of deal with weak state capacity, or is actually the fact that technology has progressed in such a fast pace or proliferated due to a strong state? To discuss all these questions and hopefully many more, I'm delighted to have with us the three speakers, Dr. Saurav Garg, Mr. Arun Sharma, and Ms. Shreyana Bhattacharya. Thank you, all three of you, for being here with us today, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you. Maybe I can start with you, Dr. Garg. The 1990s was, of course, a time of a lot of food insecurity. You were in Odisha, the famine of 1993 wreaked havoc, and there was that period of a lot of uncertainty. I think compared to that and now, one of the really positive aspects of the pandemic was that after a few initial hiccups, we actually saw lots of food grains actually reaching people's households. Whether they reach or not, we'll get to, but a lot more food grains were allocated, lifted. I think the last numbers I was seeing is some 800 million tons of food grains just under the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. And so I'd love to hear from you about that evolution from the 90s, when we had that period of food insecurity, to now. How has that period changed, and to what degree has technology and digital played a big role in that transition?
Thank you. First of all, a pleasure to be here among friends and colleagues today. 30 years back, I can look back, I'd spent about 3 years in Kalahandi in Orissa, which was infamous at that point in time. And our efforts at that time were more focused on logistics, on ensuring just that the food grain should be available at the village. We used to have distribution of food grains once in 2 months or 3 months because we were not able to ensure delivery on a regular basis, on a month-to-month basis. And I think we really didn't get into the details, the micro details, the granular details of each household getting it. We wanted availability to be there at the village level, that itself was a big. I think over the past 30 years, the increase in infrastructure in terms of roads, I think the Prime Minister Gram Sadak Yojana has really transformed rural roads to extent over the past couple of decades. The penetration of telecommunications post the mid-90s, which has ensured that information flow is so much easier than what it was, and you get to know, and internet penetration has also increased significantly, apart from, of course, the mobile penetration. And the third, I would say, is the rural electrification, which has ensured that that devices can actually work in the rural areas, and electrification is not just limited to having one pole at the village boundary, but actually on a household basis. So I think these three infrastructural changes, coupled with the fact that rice and wheat production over the past 3 decades has really increased to such an extent that we are now looking at ways on how to diversify food production. But I won't get into that. But the fact remains that we are more than surplus in food grains, which may not have been the fact 3 decades back. And along with this has been the growth in the digital communications, where at present, on a daily basis, nearly 2 crore authentications happen on Aadhaar just in PDS shops across the country. We do about 8 crore authentications a day, and about 20% of them are for food grains. So that's the kind of targeting that we have. We know which family has got how much fruit grain today and where it has been picked up. And I think that's because of the digital change that has happened. Obviously, the number of, whether it's the Aadhaar, whether it's the telecom, I mentioned about that. And the other change I would also say is the fact that over the past, which is only over the past 2 years, that we were able to do that one nation, one ration card, due to which you might be a migrant laborer in Mumbai, but you can draw your ration from Mumbai and your family can draw it wherever they are. And we've had interesting implications of that, that in some places where individual villages, they were not happy with their ration shop, they would not go to that and go to an adjacent one. And those ration shops have actually to close down because they were not giving services to the desired level to people. So that's a collateral benefit, which I didn't think any one of us anticipated this would happen. But this is the other side, and I think the 30 years, so it's a combination of a number of factors, but I think we made significant progress since then.
Thank you so much. One follow-up question on the One Nation, One Ration. What is the uptake that you've been seeing recently? Because I think there was an initial slow start. So if you have any of the recent numbers or anything that you could share on the uptake.
I don't have the exact numbers that how many people have actually figured, because I'm sure that the Department of Food Production would have that. But the fact remains that the ability to do that in itself is very empowering. Whether actually people are doing that or not, but the fact that you can do it if you do want to do it, I think that itself is so much more empowering. It's something like, just to digress a bit, the fact that when 10 years back Aadhaar was started, just the ability to say, who am I, to anyone who asks is very empowering. At the bottom of the pyramid, whenever any policeman asks, aap kaun hai? So you have something to prove who you are. And I think that's the kind of empowerment that One Nation, One Ration card gives, even if actually I don't have the details of how much has been actually used.
Thank you so much. Mr. Sharma, you were at the thick of things in some ways during the pandemic as part of the DBT mission. Put it closer. So I was saying that Mr. Sharma was in some ways in the thick of things as part of the DBT mission during the pandemic. And just looking at even just currently, 316 or 18 schemes, 53 ministries. This year alone, and we're only halfway into the financial year, some 2.38 lakh crores have been transferred via DBT. the scale is mammoth. It's in some ways an amazing and just a testimony or to just the scale of India almost. But I'm curious to know what the challenges were during that time in particular of actually making sure that money reaches into people's accounts. And linked to that, I guess, are we now in a place where we can safely say that we've coming close to a pretty efficient public finance management system? Hopefully we'll soon be able to do just-in-time financing and things like that.
Thanks, Avni. Challenges, they still exist, and I think Shayna can add more. One is the ground level challenges, and the biggest ones are the right enrollment and fixing the right entitlement. So once you get the entry by creating some kind of a golden record of the right beneficiaries, we have limited resources and we can only distribute as much. And given you mentioned the scale of the country, so there are far more needy people than the state is able to provide. So the ground level challenges were, are and will remain till the time we have a stronger state capacity, the most surmountable ones, and it's a combination of several factors. Mr. Garg mentioned a few infrastructural ones. Another, in the 30-year journey that he mapped, a significant point is the population rise. If you see what our population was in the 90s, it's not a linear increase, it's an exponential. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Okay, sorry. So, we sometimes forget, when we're talking about these numbers, we forget the scale that we operate in. It's mammoth. You go to a food distribution shop on the day the ration is delivered and you'll see the masses. Just crowd management becomes a problem. So coming back, the challenges, those still remain, and the people who are dealing with them, the people who are enrolling the beneficiaries in the programs, they work on principles or plans that are devolved from the center or from a higher office. Their decision-making power is almost negligible. Their role to do any changes in the programs is limited, but they are the cutting edge. So I'm emphasizing more and more on this. So this remains the biggest challenge in distribution of any kind of aid to the needy. The secondary or tertiary level of challenges come as you move away from the point of contact with the citizens. And these are programmatic challenges. So you can have financial problems given the center state, the federal structure of our economy and our polity. And then you have the other larger technical challenges in the banking system. Now we have Aadhaar as the bedrock of all distribution networks. Authentication with Aadhaar, enrollment into an integration into the Aadhaar system. PDS itself, Sir just mentioned the portability of benefits. It was a huge undertaking. Mapping each ration card, each family, suppose they have 4 or 5 members, each of them has an Aadhaar number which is mapped to that ration card, and anybody can go, to a ration shop and get ration. It's a massive success that we've achieved in a limited time with limited resources. So we often, just forget the scale. I re-emphasize that. So these kind of challenges will still remain. Then, there are individual challenges where grievance redressal becomes a problem if somebody has an issue, if somebody is not getting their right benefits or where to go, which office to contact. And there the citizen's own capacity becomes an issue. And I'm sure we'll cover this as we move into a digital world. The mindset of the citizen needs to change. So I'm going through several issues in short, but you get the gist that these are at the ground level, at the state level, at the central level. Some of the issues that we see constantly, we're trying to improve upon them, but there's a combination of factors. There are so many actors, there's so many agencies that are involved in this that we'll need to address. What was the second question, Avni?
To what degree? So one is the challenges, but the other is the architecture itself, which is what the technology, the infrastructure. How close are we to a very efficient public finance management system that is capable of doing all the things that we've talked about, whether it's just-in-time financing, whether it is smart payments, all the things that we've read about in theory. To what extent is our infrastructure and architecture now in place to move the needle towards that?
Okay, so now it's a very different question that you posed. An effective public financial management system has been in the works for, we have our own challenges. And the Constitution, it's interesting if you read that, the center-state relations, state finances are, a constitutional authority. And the transfer between central and the state government, it has a constitutional backing that you need to provide. So maintaining that and going down to the citizen and making sure that his or her needs are met, it becomes complicated as you move away from here and go down. So, recently the Department of Expenditure came up with a single accounting, it's called the SNA, a single national nodal account at the state level. It's close to the TSA structure that the IMF has been preaching for past 2 decades. And again, India will be, I think, the largest country across the world to establish something like that, going down to the state level first and then probably at the central level. But again, without tampering with the basic structure of the Constitution, because these are all, I keep going back to it, constitutional provisions. So either you look at amending some provisions there or creating mechanisms that are in line with whatever is given in the books. Technology helps, obviously, but state or, look at it as a balancing question, that a state or a district or a block or a village would like to have its own decision-making powers, which means that they would like to have their own funds and do what they want to do with them. But then that has a risk. If a state or a district is not performing well, if they sit on the funds or if they use the funds for some other purpose, then you have a problem. And we've seen both kind of issues, so the balancing act needs to be provided, which is what we're trying for. So to answer your question, are we close to it? Yes, every day we move closer to it. Do we have any lesser complications? No, the complications go on increasing.
Thank you so much. I think some of the issues that you mentioned about center state, we will be delving into them tomorrow as well. So please do share your thoughts tomorrow on that as well, and for the audience too. Shriyana, as I started saying, we were trying to do this tracking business, not because we had no idea. At the World Bank, you've been running large surveys looking at social protection and the extent to which households actually receive benefits. If you can share with us some of the findings of your it was a large panel data set, right, using CMI?
Yeah. I mean, with all firstly, it's such a pleasure to be here, and it's also a pleasure to reprise to a panel that existed 2 years ago, and we're back. So this is before and after COVID, and in fact, a lot of my comments will actually perhaps reflect that juncture. Avni, at the bank, along with colleagues of ours on the poverty team, we've been, and in partnership with CMIE, we've been tracking the receipt of different cash transfers, food transfers. I'd encourage those who are interested in more details. The paper's up. It's a working paper. It's called Intent to Implementation. And with all the, I think, quibbles we can have about CMIE sampling, it still gives us a sense of what's happening in the broad sense of access and targeting. And if you look at the findings from those papers, as well as what scholars say from Right to Food are producing, I think your own work, some of the work coming out of CPR, different organizations that are trying to assess this through the pandemic and even post, I think there are 3 important trends that we pick up, and I think it does relate to what Dr. Garg and Arun was saying. One is, I think it's important conceptually to disentangle payment leakage and what we would call enrollment leakage, right? Payment leakage essentially is this idea that you're supposed to receive 100 rupees through your business correspondent or through a certain account. You don't get that 100, you get, there's a certain cut taken, you're not receiving it. So it's at the point of the payment pipeline that there is some kind of extraction that's happening, be it a rent or some kind of welfare loss. The other is enrollment leakage, which is you should have been eligible, but you are eligible. You should probably be number one on the priority line, but you're not receiving the benefit. You're somehow, because of discretion, because of all the, I think what Arun described very beautifully as all these local, complex, discretionary challenges of the state. I think this has stopped. No, I think I'm audible. What we find from at least the period coming out of COVID and through COVID is that while food transfers seem to reach around 80% of households that we were tracking, and this stays actually broadly consistent if you look at female-headed households, scheduled caste households, you see some drops when it comes to tribal households, but it stays broadly in that sort of 77 to 82% coverage domain. However, when you come to cash, which is I know what we're discussing today, you suddenly see in rural areas access drops to around 50%. Of households. And one of the key reasons, and this was articulated and debated a lot during the pandemic and lockdowns, is the lack of what Arun was describing, a who-to-pay database, right? Who do you, at the time of crisis, how do you know who should be in? Is there a mechanism through which you can prioritize people? The socioeconomic census is very old and late. Some programs, perhaps the PDS is a much more dynamic database. You can think about converting it linked to bank accounts, which is happening, but only about 30% of those accounts are seeded right now, and there's more going on in that direction. So I think the first trend we're picking up is food seems to reach more people because of social mobilization. There's a rights-based regime. There's a lot of work. I mean, I think Dr. Garg was describing 30 years of work that's gone into sort of building that system. And you saw during COVID that it reached people. And then we can talk about whether the full grain entitlement reached you, were there exclusions because of the use of technology? And I think there's been a lot of journalistic reportage. There have been lots of activists and scholars who've been writing about this. So that's one. But cash is yet to scale. And part of the reason is not perhaps now the payment leakage problem itself. Our understanding, looking at the data and looking at our conversations that we have also with local government officials and different state governments we work in, is actually this, who do you pay? So that's one. The second thing I wanted to highlight that we're learning is there's a huge gap between urban and rural. Again, this is something that was said during the course of the pandemic. What we find is the 50% is actually for rural households. You go to urban, it drops to around 33%, and that's the highest that we get at a state level. All the annexures are available in the paper for anyone who wants to sort of get into details. Please do look at it. And again, I think I'm back now. One of the things we realize is that this is also, of course, because the urban programs for cash delivery just don't exist. We've invested in a history through Narega, through different kinds of programs, even the PM Kisan program, in states like Orissa, there's Kalia, which Dr. Garg was, spearheading in a way. And I think you have all these state platforms for rural populations that are vulnerable. And there are building blocks there, but the urban still doesn't exist. And we're seeing different states. Again, Odisha has come up with an urban wage employment program. Himachal is trying to do something similar, but at the national level, that conversation doesn't exist. So I'll close with this, which is, I think we make the mistake, looking at this data and looking at these trends, I think we make the mistake of thinking the Agriculture Ministry technology in leveraging, say, a safety net or creating a safe and productive safety net that covers the right people, that this is essentially a technocratic problem. And I think Arun was hinting at the fact that it's not. It's a policy issue. So for example, technology can play a huge role in providing a feedback loop back to departments of finance on what the budgets of programs should be. You look at the current architecture, Avni, you started with this, it's sort of 300 plus schemes, but 70% of beneficiaries and 65% of funds are sitting with 7 programs, right? The question is, sure, maybe there's a political economy about why the other programs exist, but at the state level, if we have, for example, social delivery platforms that collect data governed by clear data protection frameworks, that at least give some feedback back to the departments of finance and planning that, look, this is the pending budget gap. Can we think about the next budget cycle, increasing allocations here, reducing allocations there? Then these challenges of rationing, which is actually why you're also seeing these exclusion errors, can be addressed. The second is, I think Arun again mentioned, this center state issue. We don't, unlike many other emerging countries, you look at a Brazil or you look at Indonesia, there are platforms which actually allow for regional governments, subnational governments, and national governments to arbitrate and discuss budgets and financing around social policy. I'm hopeful that that will start to be built slowly, but you imagine something similar to a GST framework, and that I think is currently missing, and that's really critical, I think, because of all the points that Arun was raising in deciding what is the budget envelope, who decides, and then what are the rules so that there is also some sensible spending and a clear fiscal path which adheres to all these fiscal responsibility norms. I think that's really important. So I'll stop there just to say I think we see in the data this gap between cash and food. A lot of it is actually not just technology induced, but it's also policy. How much is India spending? How much is for these particular programs? And second is this urban-rural. And again, this goes back to not just a technical fix, but these are now policy questions which need to be arbitrated through some sort of a policy mechanism. And I think that really, those are really, I think, to us, some of the key questions that at least we're contending with in our dialogues. Thanks.
Yeah. Just to jump in, because maybe I have a slightly different view. I was surprised to find that on the cash side, there seems to be a lower penetration of access than on kind. But before I mention that, on the PFMS that you were mentioning, the Public Financial Management System, and that relates to what Shreya calls the payment leakages. I think on the PFMS side, we now have the plumbing in place, which ensures that you have the ability to open the tap at state level, central level, and it will reach the beneficiary. Whether you open the tap or not is a constitutional legal issue, so I'm not getting into that. But the reason why you have that plumbing in place is also because of the JAM Trinity, the Jan Dhan Aadhaar mobile. And just to give figures, we have a population of around 135 crore as of today, 1.35 billion. We have around 134 crore Aadhaar cards. It's the 0 to 5 age group, which is where you have a gap. Adults over the age of 18, 100% have an Aadhaar across the country. On the bank accounts, you have around 140 crore bank accounts in the country. Obviously, there will be duplicates people have. Out of these 140 crores, around 45 crore bank accounts are due to the Jan Dhan Yojana, which was started in. And you have around 120 crore mobile phones in the country, out of which around 65 crore are smartphones. So what I'm saying is the JAM Trinity nearly saturates the total population. Even if it doesn't saturate the population fully, if you look at it at a household level, perhaps every one household would have a smartphone in their household if each of the members don't have it. And definitely at least one person has a bank account, and Aadhaar, obviously everyone has an individual one. So given where we are on the JAM Trinity, where we are on the communication network infrastructure, I'm not getting into it, we have the ability of transferring funds to an individual household, if not to an individual person from at any level, from the central or the state level. So that's on the plumbing aspect, the payments. And that is why I am surprised to hear that the study finds that the actual reach is only around 50%. Because what the data suggests, and I'll just give the data of Orissa, since I'm familiar with that state, having spent a number of years there. The population of Orissa is around 4 crores. So assuming a 4 or 5 person per household, you have 1 crore households. The number of people who are enrolled in the PDS is somewhere around 80 lakh households. So given that Orissa has a slightly lower socio-economic level, 80 lakh is a very, very reasonable. One would not expect anyone to be, there could be obviously exclusions, but my sense it would be really. And just to give another example, which I'm very familiar on the agriculture side, we had around 40 lakh households which were under Kalia and then later under PM Kisan, which also seems to indicate, fair enough, I mean 40 lakh out of 1 crore. The estimates are anywhere between 50% to 60% of population. The 40 lakh also includes landless households, etc. So the possibility of exclusion errors seems to be much lower than what was maybe a decade back. And why I'm talking about this is that the PDS is a transfer in kind, PM Kisan is a transfer in cash. My sense would be, given the kind of plumbing we have, given the kind of logistics infrastructure we have, to say I'm unable to accept that there's only a 50% reach in terms of cash and a much higher end. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah.
No, and in fact, one should not be able to accept it. But what we find in the data, and this is not just, I think, CMIE, I think you're seeing this coming out in different kinds of surveys that are going on the ground. Azim Premji University actually puts all of this together in a very useful schematic. I think the challenge is enrollment. What we find, and there was a really wonderful, I think, short op-ed, I think it was written by Dr. Rajesh Bansal, essentially saying that if you don't know who to pay, so for example, what we find in the surveys, if you're registered in the social pension scheme or you were registered, then you receive the benefit. So exactly as Arun was saying, that it's, if you're on the database, you'll receive it. What the challenge seems to be is in programs which are not near universal, and many of the programs still continue to use different kinds of targeting criteria, be it SEC, be it different kinds of income proofs, eligibility proofs. I mean, I think you have a sense of this landscape. What we're seeing is that proof still continues to be a burden. Moving programs perhaps to a more near universal landscape in eligibility rules is one way to address it, and we see in the PDS example that's really helped because it suddenly opened up coverage. What we do find in the data, though, is it's that challenge of getting yourself registered onto that database, which different states, I should say, are trying very innovative approaches to try and address. So, for example, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, they are creating these integrated delivery platforms for enrollment and targeting. Orissa is creating one as well. There's Kerala, there are different states. But you're seeing this now at the state level, I think in response to the fact that there is this enrollment and access to reach and register themselves, that's broadly a binding constraint. I'll stop there, thanks.
And part of that, and I would like to bring Mr. Sharma in here, is that a lot of the efficiency argument when it comes to technology has been to plug leakages. So the DBT portal also has that figure of savings or gain. I think till March 21, there was some 2.2 lakh crore savings or gain, and to some degree it makes sense. Of course, we know that state finances are weak, we know that a lot of money is tied to committed liability, so you have to kind of hold your resources and spend them well. But are we then not just too focused on that saving and not really focusing enough on inclusion? To what extent are we actually even thinking of the exclusion errors?
Yeah, so this is another set of balancing equations that you need to factor in. I mean, what do you do? So as Shayana said, you know, if you're, and I think both my co-panelists, they were saying the same thing. If you're in the database, the rate of failures for, and this is, you know, a couple of months old, these figures may have changed, but for cash transfers, for electronic payments, it's almost 98.5%, the success rate. And for in-kind transfers, it's little less. It's, I think, at 98 or 97 point something %. So if you're in the system, you will get some form of benefits. That's there. Now, the bigger question that we are perpetually trying to solve is the right targeting, not to leave anybody behind. Exclusion errors have been there, for all kinds of reasons, for the simple rules that we make for program delivery, who is eligible. And out of a set of, let's say if there are 100 households in a village, and if all 100 qualify, then your target would only be about 10 or 15. You can't cover them all unless it's, very few schemes are completely universal, given the constraints that we have on our resources. So again, it's a mix of who needs more. The way to go about it would be that you cross target across multiple schemes. Like we have in the income tax, that if you have one of these things, then you have to file your income taxes. And again, then we get into something that maybe Dr. Garg wouldn't want to. How do you identify people across multiple databases? Then we come to Aadhaar being the force that can do this, and then we come to the debate around whether we should do it, privacy, surveillance, and blah, blah, blah. So it's not that we haven't thought about it, we have been thinking about it, and we tie ourselves in these knots that we try to unsolve, and
Can I just say one thing, and I know Dr. Garg will have, for example, one of the things that we've been discussing and all are going to take the AAY households, the chronic poor households that are identified by the PDS. Ideally, you should say, there could be a policy statement. This is just a hypothetical saying all AAY households automatically are eligible and should just automatically be registered for, say, social pensions, a core set of benefits. But Arun raises the really important point, which is that requires a governance framework. So I want to go back to that point I started, which is this is not an issue of just technology pipelines. I think there are broader policy, legal, and governance issues here, which really are, to my sense, my reading of the situation is right now, those are the binding constraints. And now I'm very eager to hear what Dr. Garg has to say.
Before you respond, I'm throwing in one more question, which is linked to what Shreyana said, is that in some ways, if we are struggling with targeting universal programs, maybe the way to go for a certain set of schemes. There's been one recent contentious change in some of the guidelines where even previously universal schemes, like now the previously known as ICD, as now Sakshan Anganwadi and Poshan 2.0, has in the guidelines a clause that says that the only precondition is that you need to have an Aadhaar. There have been several media reports that are talking about that because of this clause, people have been denied. We haven't yet done any research on this. We should. But there have been media reportage on the fact that it has led to denial of benefits. And this is for zero to mothers, children, pregnant women. So I'd love your thoughts on that as well.
Sure. Yeah, okay. So first on this targeting, I would just like to, maybe we're talking about universal targeting and where we have some eligibility criteria. And no doubt universal targeting is much more easier, maybe politically also, administratively also. It's so much more convenient. And I think we don't get into any exclusion errors in that. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that given where we are on the Aadhaar enrollment, and I'll come to the second part later on, where it's 100% adults resident in India have an Aadhaar. And I would be very happy if someone can bring out a person who doesn't have an Aadhaar. That will give us, test the hypothesis. And we are very keen to do that because we want to ensure that everyone, we just have some pockets in one northeast state and in Ladakh pockets where there are some pockets and which we are hopeful before the end of this financial year also we'll cover that also. So given the fact that we have 100% enrollment of adults, in fact, Aadhaar becomes a mode of inclusion rather than a mode of exclusion, because people who you did not know existed, by the fact that they have their Aadhaar, they actually exist and you can probably reach out to them. And the most vulnerable would never reach out on their own until someone goes to them. So on the universal, no doubt it becomes so much easier on the criteria that we have, and that's why I think the attempt has been now to have a minimum number of criteria of eligibility and have it so much more easier to measure or easier to for people to understand, so that the errors of exclusion are reduced to the bare minimum, and we don't have that a large number of eligible people are not getting it. The second part, which is what you were talking about, the children, just to give the statistics, as I mentioned, over the age of 18, it's 100%. If you look at the Aadhaar penetration between the ages of 6 to 18, it is around 93%. And 0 to 5, it is around 40%. And 0 to 5 would always be a moving target. You have 2.5 to 3 crore births a year. And therefore, by the time of age of 5, the child gets an Aadhaar. But the 0 to 5 age group Aadhaar is linked to their parents because we don't collect biometrics. Biometrics don't stabilize, and therefore you have a mandatory biometric update at the age of 5 and then again at the age of 15, after which it more or less stabilizes. So under the portion scheme, I don't have the full details, but from whatever I know, it's that either the child has the Aadhaar or the mother has the Aadhaar. So given that the fact that the mother would be 18 years plus and there's 100% seeding, so I am not too sure whether that can be a cause for exclusion of any child. And that's how the scheme has been designed.
So I wanted to shift gears a little bit. We were just talking that we forget sometimes that technology has a human face as well. So I wanted to start with you, Shreyana. I think one of the things with technology is that there is a power asymmetry in some ways between those that kind of design it and those that are using it or experiencing it. And I know that when we used to go down to the field, you had access to a large degree as a citizen to your local BDO, to your sarpanch, both in terms of bargaining for that entitlement, but also then to some degree negotiating those rights. Now technology in some ways leads to this invisibility of the state. Would love your thoughts on what that means. What has changed between the citizen-state interaction, and what does that mean for things like grievance redressal?
You raise a really important point. In fact, 2 years ago when we were on this panel, I had actually raised an example which I want to sort of bring up again, which is I remember for a project, we were in Jharkhand and I was interviewing a bunch of elderly women waiting essentially for a social pension payment, and they were in the middle of a transition because earlier it was the panchayat who would organize these camps, the payment space, and then it was moving to essentially them relying on a BC. And one of them said to me, she said, "Computer bolta hai aur mujhe samajh mein nahi aata computer kya bol raha hai," and then you have to wait. She received her payment, but I could sense that there was a sense of transition, right? And especially there are behavioral rigidities, especially amongst people who are not digitally literate. This is acute, particularly for women. We should remember the NFHS just recently tells us only 50% of women have a mobile phone that they're accessing on their own, right? It leads to gaps when it comes to access and familiarity of access based on very social identity and sort of social norms of who can access what, right? So I think that is a challenge, and it continues to be. And you saw it during the pandemic. The studies that are out there that were talking about women's compromised access, even with the Jan Dhan accounts, right? The transfers that they were receiving just to go out and access them. And I think, I'm sure Arun and Dr. Garg will have more to say on how we can track that and address those. I think there are two things that need to be done, and some states are already doing it. You saw, for example, during the pandemic as well, many state governments started to leverage this giant self-help group machinery, right? Be it through, kitchens, counseling, providing care, different kinds of actions that this sort of community infrastructure was used for. My sense is with the increased use of technology and the fact that we know there will be people who will struggle, especially those who these programs need to reach, there will be struggle. Even with, very digitally glib young men perhaps in a village, there might be elderly women, there might be tribal women who will struggle. Given that, I think the need for social workers or people at the local level within the local state who can help and ease entry barriers and also address many of the issues that you raised about grievance exclusion, keeping a log of that, but having the right skill sets. often now when you go to the local state, and this is something Yamini and I discuss all the time, we see engineers, we see a lot of, there's a certain kind of skill set which is terrific, but I think you need to marry it also with those who are able to actually help people access, understand programs differently, and come from a slightly different talent set and point of view. I think that, so right sizing, training, and getting the local state to have a diverse portfolio of skills, I think that will be really critical. Doesn't mean there needs to be one at every BDO office, but there needs to at least be a small cadre that you can rely on and you can use in different ways in conjunction with the SHG groups, because I think we're also now reaching a phase where we might be overloading some community infrastructure and frontline cadres that we have, right? And there's data that shows us that. So I think, to me, the future of grievance redress, when I think about the conversations we're having with state governments, we're looking at the data, is perhaps diversifying the skill mix that is available. And the second, which is where I think technologists have a role to play, which is the user actually involved in the design and thinking through of some of these technology tools? For example, when you're thinking about shifting a payment mechanism, or when we create these new targeting mechanisms for the future, are we stress testing them? Are we user testing them? I think that is really critical. And it's high time, I feel, and this is a personal observation, which is, you go into now conversations on social policy, and I'm not wearing my World Bank hat at all here, this is a personal observation, is that you go into conversations on policy, and, often it's technologists and people who come from a very, it's that sort of engineering, hardware, software point of view, which is very useful. But I think we need to, again, in those spaces, also diversify who is speaking in those spaces and who's providing input in those spaces. So that, I think, deliberation around technology is going to be very critical as we move forward, because it is foundational to the future welfare state. But then we need to bring in diverse perspectives. But I'm hopeful, because one sees that there are different groups that are getting involved. But I think critically around gender, and critically around those who really struggle with digital literacy, we will need different skill sets, be it a social worker or local workers who can help, in addition to the community infrastructure that the government's built. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Shreyana. And I think we have a panel just after this one on looking at female labor force participation in a gig economy as well. And I think, as you said, it's going to be critical. So one is, of course, how the citizen engages with the state, but then also how the state engages in some ways. They used to say that about decentralization, that everyone loves decentralization up to their own level. We see that to some degree with technology as well, in the sense that most of our conversations often with government is that I want to use technology to see what people are doing that are below me. It's used a lot as a monitoring tool, and everyone wants dashboards where I can actually visualize what's happening at different levels. I want to be able to visualize all my blocks, all my districts, all my schools. But the second you try and move that conversation about how you're using technology to actually plan and budget effectively, or even to empower the frontline state to be able to do some of these things, the conversation sometimes slightly fizzles out. So I would love to hear from both of you actually on, have we overloaded in some ways the frontline state without actually thinking about the planning capacity, the budgeting capacity, or even just capacity to be able to do all of these things? We just collected data. We work in 5 states, and we try to just understand. We wanted to know like how many health apps there are. And all of our states have been sending us, there are like 5, 6 health apps in every state. And all of them are filled by frontline workers. Now we've got a lot of technology and a lot of kind of demand on the frontline state, but have we actually thought through those capacities, both in terms of the capacity of the state to, frontline state to engage, but also how are we using that information? So over to both of you. Love your responses.
Just before I talk about the state engaging with the citizen, just one point on the citizen engaging with the state. We need to recognize that there's a limit to the physical interactions because of the costs and resources required, not only financial, but even manpower resources. So I think technology provides a segue into ensuring easier access. And I'll just give 2 examples. In the UIDI system, we get around 2 lakh queries a day, because given the fact that you have, and out of that 2 lakh queries, we have 7 sets of modes of interaction Obviously, the voice, IVRF, we have a voice, we have 1947, which is our helpline number. So we have a helpline number, we have the email, we have a WhatsApp message you can send it to, you have Facebook, Twitter, chatbot, etc. And out of the 2 lakh queries, nearly 1.5 or 1.6 lakh are voice. And one of the things we must recognize that voice offers an anonymity which personal interaction doesn't, and that in itself has some value. It might also be misused, but that's fair enough. There'll always, it's a bell-shaped cave. You always have some people at 2 ends of the spectrum. But the fact remains that people are using it, but at the same time, we need that physical. And out of the 2 lakh queries, a few hundreds are only walk-ins in our various offices, and that might be due to the fact that for a walk-in you have to travel or whatever distance, etc. So I'm not saying that it is not important, it's there, but we need, I think technology only amplifies the ability for the state to engage, or more importantly, for the individual to engage with the state, and we should not lose sight of that. Coming to the reverse part of the citizen, the state engaging, perhaps what you're referring to is not necessarily with the citizen, but with the frontline workers. And while monitoring is no doubt one very important tool, but I think we often don't give enough attention to the fact that it can become a very powerful tool for information sharing with the frontline staff and capacity building, etc. Because if we send, we've created these nuggets, video nuggets for our frontline staff, which are 2-minute nuggets, which just talk of one aspect of something to do with, earlier it was on the agriculture side in my previous assignment, now on enrollment or something. And we keep sending it to their smartphones once in a week. So he might just see it for 5 minutes, or he or she, but that frontline workers' ability or the knowledge increases, whether it might be on the soft power, on how behaviorally one can engage with citizens. So I think it's also a very important tool for strengthening and capacity building of the frontline staff. No doubt monitoring becomes so much better. I think attendance in government offices has skyrocketed only because of the biometric attendance, and there's nothing wrong in that. I would think it helps the citizen, it helps the state.
Nothing more to add on this actually. But on the capacity of the frontline versus what the expectations are, yes, there's an imbalance there where they're expected to do too much, which is not commensurate to the resources that they provided or the trainings or the capacities that they've been provided with. But that's the structure that we have. The way to supplement it would be to provide more resources and more people maybe. This will be, till the time we come to a steady state in devolution of powers, authority, capacity, etc. But you did mention an interesting point, and I'll segue into that. You said every state has 5 or 6 health apps, or either. So that just led me to another thought, which I, since we're talking a lot about technology. What has been missing in the tech sphere, tech space, especially the governance technology, is the whole of government approach. Now, if there are 5 or 6 health apps, who should take a call on that? Ideally, the health ministry. But the health ministry does not deal in technology. It deals in issues pertaining to health. So then it comes to a ministry like the IT. And the IT ministry so far, in its DNA, was providing a supporting function. So only recently, in the past couple of years, the thinking has been changed to provide a leading role in enabling that. So the way that the changes that we'll see going forward, a couple of months back, we in the Ministry of IT had issued the NDGFP, the National Data Governance Framework Policy, which talks about setting up of an IDMO, an Indian Data Management Office, which will have counterparts in each ministry and each state. And their job would be to streamline the collection of data, the format of data, the storing of data. So all these things that we are discussing, whether there is duplicity, multiplicity of forms and factors that are collating the same kind of data, would have to pass through that. So hopefully that aspect of, although it wasn't a question, but it's an important thing, because if I'm a citizen and I'm providing my data to multiple agencies for a similar kind of a role or a function, then it's a waste of effort on both sides.
This aspect of how do you ensure interoperability of data sets going forward, and I think we've tried many things. So far, they haven't yet been successful, but at least we are we are actively thinking about it. I do want to open it up for audience questions. So my final segment, we'll make this one short. I started off talking about the pandemic because we're here 2 years later, but the pandemic, of course, was its mammoth scale and has not just nationally affected everyone, but of course globally as well. But every day we are dealing with some form of crisis or the other across states. You were in Odisha. Odisha has had its fair share. We work in Satara district. We work in Purnia district. Every year floods come and there are blocks that are inaccessible. Not only there is the infrastructure kind of dwindle, but even just basic services are missing. What do we need going forward to be able to deal with these crises? And climate change means that they are going to keep coming again and again, and they are a reality that we need to contend with. So maybe I can start with Shreyana first. It would be great to hear your thoughts on. Hopefully, we're not having this conversation again.
No, unfortunately, I think we will be having this. The conversation on climate and adaptive safety nets is, I think it's a conversation now of the future and the present. I'm sure Dr. Garg, she will have a lot more to say on this, given the experience of Fanny and others in Orissa. I think what's very critical, and we're doing this in different states, it's very early days, Avni, is linking perhaps early warning systems, which are typically the mandate of, say, disaster risk, the management authorities. So working with NDMA, the state disaster management authorities, but linking those early warning alerts to this idea of a who to pay database or who to provide relief to database. Could be the PDS, could be Kalya, for example, in the context of Orissa. But if you can understand that there's an early warning, there are geographic communities that you know and anticipate, because now you have a sense, governments do have a sense of what the spread of these types of impacts can be. And then you're prepared with at least some data building blocks that can allow you to release support, provide cash in time. Because what tends to happen with this, there's data that came out of Chennai. There's a paper, in fact, I think written by Professor Ila Patnaik and her colleagues, essentially finding that if you didn't provide relief in Chennai at the right time, unsurprisingly, indebtedness levels just go up significantly, particularly in urban areas, because the rural safety net doesn't exist. And so the need to create perhaps nimble data architecture, along with physical architecture, with a plan whereby if there are communities that you anticipate are constantly being impacted by droughts or cyclones, in combination with NREGA, but particularly in urban areas, you're able to release some support. I think creating those agile systems which are quite adaptive, and again, I'll stress this who to pay, this idea of, in other countries they call it a registry, here you could call it a delivery platform, some kind of platform that allows you to do that and trigger immediate support at the right time is going to be a very critical agenda moving forward. Thanks.
And Mr. Sharma and Dr. Garg, one game changer that you think, excluding Aadhaar, I'm not giving you the easy answer, one game changer when it comes to technology to be able to have that nimble architecture in your minds?
Before I talk about one game changer, it's a cliche, but I just want to repeat it, that for any disaster, probably it's what they call the 5R framework, that you first have the rescue, then relief, then rehabilitation, then rebuilding. And the 5th R, which we don't give enough importance to, is resilience. So I think it's the 5th R whenever there's no disaster that we need to have disaster resilient infrastructure, disaster resilient processes, etc. And I think an attempt has been made, whether it's a cyclone, it's a flood. Everyone knows where the cyclone will broadly hit. You know where the flood is going to hit. You know which are the areas which are going to be drought prone. You know which are the areas where the pests will hit given the experience. So it's not rocket science to be able to predict what will happen. And I think I'm giving examples of cyclones in Orissa because 30 years back when I joined service, you heard of one cyclone in 5 years, and 30 years later, we have 5 cyclones in a year. So I think that's the change that has happened. And we also know broadly where the cyclone will hit. We know what are the implications of the cyclone, and on each of the 5 hours, there's a well set out protocol, what you have to do for each and there. And I think it's not a technological solution, it's going to be a process solution. It's an SOP solution, it's a training solution, it's a capacity building solution of the ground level staff, because this information perhaps can be sent around, but the actual movement of people, actual anticipation of what needs to be done has to be done at the ground level by being monitored maybe technologically. And I think space technology is something which will really help. And it's helped in cyclones, it helps in floods, it helps in pest attack, it helps in droughts. And I think GIS space technologies would really help going forward.
Last words. Game changer.
Game changer so far. I think we've yet to see the best is yet to come. But, our game changer, I think, in my view, has been our payment systems, our retail payment system especially. I think they're by far the best in the world.
Thank you. We'll move to audience questions now. If you can just request, please keep it to a question, not a comment. And if you can keep it succinct.
Question to Shrana, actually the whole panel. Is there any thinking within the bank or within the government on what do we do with this question of the urban issue? And I'm speaking because I'm an urban planner and I work in CPR on the urban side, and this has been a huge gap, and everything that Arun said seems to feed into, that question that, it's whole of government, whole of society, blah, 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 but what are we going to do about it? So is there even a beginning of a thought on how we're going to approach that issue?
Yes. Thanks a lot for this interesting discussion. I wanted to ask you about one suggestion which has been there actually for a very long time. I mean, Ritika Kera and Jean Drees have been suggesting to have simple exclusion criteria for certain schemes. And my question related to this is, I think this could actually simplify the enrollment burden, especially for schemes such as the social pension scheme in India. So my question is there actually also like a political will to move into the direction of having simple exclusion criteria for certain schemes, such as the social pension? Thank you.
Question is to Shreyana ma'am. Ma'am, the government of India or government of state is transferring money to beneficiaries through DBT. But most people in villages or remote villages are withdrawing this money in cash form. So is it not a challenge for a cashless economy or digital economy?
I'll take the last 2 points, one on the exclusion criteria and the cashless part. I think there is a preference for having simpler schemes, and if you look at, I think Shreyana alluded to that a large proportion of the government benefits or subsidies are hardly in 6 or 7 schemes, and most of them are very simple schemes, whether it's PDS, whether it's PM Kisan, whether it's the NSAP, social assistance, which have very simple criteria, not too complicated, and I think that's the way to go perhaps. And willy-nilly, whether by conscious design or by unconscious means, involuntarily we are moving to that. So it makes so much sense, as I mentioned, both politically and administratively, it's very, very convenient to have limited exclusion criteria and have it more or less universal. On the second part on the DBT being to bank accounts, I think ultimately whether ultimately the resident would use cash or cashless is partly dependent on the extent of digital transactions in the society. Globally, India has 40% of digital transactions globally happen in India. We are the largest country which has the largest number of digital transactions. So the very fact that now you can pay for a Golgappa also by a QR code is significant in terms of that. but the ability of a resident staying in any of the 7 lakh villages to be able to withdraw cash at the village point is because of the ability of the Aadhaar-enabled payment systems, where you have 50 lakh those mini card reader machines, POS machines, where you can go to the panwala, put your fingerprint, access your account, and access 100 rupees. The ability to do that is because of the digital systems that are. Ultimately, you might use cash, and hopefully, over time, perhaps even that will not become necessary.
I'll take the urban question first. So, in fact, we are, at least our teams right now, are in the middle of assessing different city and town level safety nets and social insurance systems. And we will be reaching out to your teams. I was discussing with Yamini as well, as this work starts to proceed. But there are two things that are very critical. What we're seeing is different states are approaching this differently. There is a consensus around this idea of a wage guarantee. So you're seeing, I think there are nearly 6 states that are now experimenting. There are states like Orissa where this is now very much active and live. It's a large-scale program reaching significant numbers of people. There are challenges there, but I don't want to go. There's a wonderful symposium. I think several people have contributed to it on what is the sort of future. I think it's on ideas for India. Yamini has a piece in there as well. Take a look at that. I think there are lots of implementation challenges. But I think actually the future of urban is not perhaps just direct transfers. Given actually urban populations tend to be what we call sort of this missing middle of the safety nets and the social insurance story, because these are workers who can perhaps save sporadically small amounts. So you need to think also of co-contributory mechanisms. And there are lots of social insurance schemes that have been rolled out by consecutive governments. Uptake, though, remains low. So I'm thinking of, future co-contributory pensions, health insurance. Health insurance, there's high registration, but in urban, it's still low. You look at accident insurance, all these different kinds of schemes. PM SWAYAM right now has, I think, a coverage of around 13% of informal workers. And I think, for example, just linking this to the question of simpler exclusion criteria, one thing you could say is anyone who doesn't have a provident fund is eligible for all of these programs, because the Provident Fund is a proxy for formality, right? There need to be conversations in that space. And the one really important innovation that has happened in this space, which is the Isram Database. We can talk about, well, is it well implemented in different places, but it's a very important first building block to, again, create this data architecture where actually informal workers can access a core set of welfare funds and benefits. So I think Isram, along with social insurance, those will be really critical pathways. And creating skill sets at the municipal level. Because while the panchayats have, you have a Gram Sevak who is involved in Narega, you have Rozgar Sevaks, you just don't have the similar urban skill sets at the municipality or at the local level. So I think those 3 are going to be really critical moving forward. I don't actually have much to add to what Dr. Garg said on the cashless story, but I do want to say that gender and tribal communities will struggle when it continues to be, which is why I feel in all these architectures, and I think there's a lot that's been said about this, is you always need an exit option out as well for people who are struggling to access that cash. And it typically tends to be female-headed households and tribal communities. On the simpler exclusion, I think there's not much to add to what Dr. Garg said, but I want to add 2 things. We do have history in India, and we studied the social pension scheme because the social pension scheme was actually relaxed in its eligibility criteria. But what we found was even with that on-paper relaxation, the in-practice coverage remained constrained because of the rationing issue around budgets. And I want to just go back to that first point that I made, that while we can, of course, relax criteria, and that's critical, open it up, so there's political pressure as well at local officials to try and open up programs. There needs to be a parallel conversation on how to assess the budgetary scope to actually honor credibly this idea of inclusion, so that it's not just on paper, but it exists in practice. So yes, on exclusion criteria, I think there's a lot you're seeing. Different government schemes are rationalizing. They're saying things like you do self-attestation for income proofs, for example. But the challenge with that is, while then the queue becomes very long, the budgets to actually meet them perhaps remain similar. And so then again, local government officials have to figure out a way to ration. And I think that's really going to be critical, thinking through very carefully what's the budgeting architecture for this. Thanks.
Hi.
Just wanted to highlight, we've been talking about the success of the payment story in India, especially with the Jam Trinity and, UPI framework, etc. But one thing that, I wanted the panelists' feedback was the role of the private sector that has played a significant role in the payment sector, right? In the last about 8 or 10 years, we've seen private sector pump in about $4 to $5 billion in basically increasing the penetration to the in the last mile as far as merchant signups are concerned. However, some of the government policies in the last 4 to 5 years, as far as merchant discount rates being drawn down to zero, wherein some of these payment companies have not been able to extract their share of commissions from merchants that would make them a sustainable business model, has not been there, primarily because the government policy to increase penetration. Right now, my question is: given that the private sector has played such a big role, has pumped in capital, has increased the penetration, where do you think the government role lies as far as incentivizing these private sector players to continue to be important players and not withdraw because the business model is still not sustainable?
Sure.
Okay, I have a list to actually ask, but yeah, quickly within 30 seconds. So 3 important points. We know decentralized planning is the base for a robust PFMS. So how technology can help that in terms of having those decentralized planning consolidated in the program budgeting and implementation. And all about technology is all about monitoring at the top level. Second point is about digitization of data, public finance data we're talking. And then there is enormous gap in digitization of data, and I'm talking about the grassroots level. I'm not talking about even the block level or district level or the state level. What about panchayat level? And aligning with the political boundaries or even administrative boundaries with the service delivery institution. And third and important point I'm asking, this is something with regard to the capacity building or capacity issue. And I'm really glad that Arun talked about this IDMO, and I'm really hopeful that has been a discussion for last couple of years, but now it is going beyond state capital to the block level, where the consolidation of data is happening, and that is really feeding into the policy making process. Thank you.
So I got the payments genie out of the bag. I'll take your question. Very honest response to that. Which private companies, Google, Walmart, they were important, no doubt. It was a behavioral change. If you look at the journey, don't look at the past 2-3 years, look at the past 10, 12 years. There was a time where RBI had decided upon setting up a fund to support these payment initiatives when the PPI licenses were issued in 2012. That was never needed. That fund came about its creation almost, but it was never needed because there was deployment. SoftBank pumped Paytm, Google came in, Walmart came in. So there is a story, there is a market. Behaviors are changed, in this way. There is a leap that is taken. We are not stable in the payments domain yet. We've only hit the urban centers. When we go down to the villages, and it's important to subsidize these payments through a government/private venture, we will see changes coming up. Even the finance ministry has never emphatically said that MDRs would not be touched. There will always be room for negotiation, let's put it that way.
No, all I can say is, on the first question, that the private sector role is absolutely integral to the growth of the payments business, and I'm sure the conversations are going on in this regard.
I think on your point about feedback loops, and so for example, we have a program in Orissa, and one of the key components of it is actually converting PDF files into so I completely share, I think, that concern of digitization, but you're seeing big shifts. I think different states are trying different models. But the second thing I will say is on the planning and budgeting side, there are village level, for example, different planning mechanisms, and yet the data use that they're actually using, relying, familiar with, remains, I think, something that needs to be worked on. And you are seeing again, for example, now village level disaster management plans, they are using different kinds of information, geospatial information as well, trying to socialize and involve communities to actually think through some of this planning. So you will see changes, but those concerns they continue to be really critical. But different states, at least where we have projects, we're seeing this big push to at least make data much more accessible through the departments of, say, statistics and so on, to involve them as allies in at least the community planning process. But it's a long way because, I mean, I think all of us who are familiar with decentralized planning is a very complex, layered issue. But you are seeing data being provided at least as an asset into that process. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone in the audience, and big thank you to our three panelists. Really appreciate the insightful discussions, but also your candidness on talking about some of these issues. So hopefully 2 years from now, we will be having a very different set of conversations and have moved the needle since the plumbing architecture at least is in place. But thank you all so much for joining us and making the CPR dialogues go off to a roaring start.